please join me in welcoming Professor Julia Laite.
Thank you so much for coming, and thanks so much to Gresham College and to the ISRF. As you can tell, I'm a big fan of this funder, having gotten supported by them twice. So I'm here to speak about Shanawdithit, a woman at the end of the world. From the window, maybe she could watch the harbor, see its tangle of sails and rigging, hear the clamor of men shouting from the wharves, smell the sharp, nose-stinging smell of drying fish and rotting cod oil. Above her, a wall clock ticked. Beneath her, squeaking pine floorboards. To her left, more rooms where visitors came and went, and to her right, the windows. Across the water, the hills rose, inky green with fir and spruce, which stretched like a wall to where the harbor opened its narrow mouth to the sea. Through the thin glass of the gridded window, she would have been able to hear the river that the white people called Waterford after their distant homeland. It flowed through the forests of her territory until it spilled its fresh water into the stinking port of St. John's, Newfoundland. There are things I will never know, and some things I know for certain. I know that Shanawdithit sat in a room with a window near St. John's Harbor in the autumn and winter of 1828 and 1829 because she drew it with her own hands. Roop's plantation, to be specific, the home of the man who had rescued her or kidnapped her, depending on who you ask. He was William Epps Cormack, a dilettante naturalist and a middling sort of merchant who made the saving of her people, the Beothuk, his cause célèbre. He had brought Shanawdithit to St. John's in the late summer of 1828, after taking her from the home of her white master in a small fishing village further west. Installing her in Roop's plantation, which was, despite its name, just a modest wooden house with 2 storehouses and a wharf, Cormack tore pages from his merchant ledger book and asked her to draw him maps, stories, and images about her people, whom he feared were on the brink of total cultural destruction. I do not know exactly what Shanawdithit saw in St. John's, nor much of what she did. I know very little of what she thought. I know for certain that St. John's reeked in the 1820s, when the Newfoundland trade for salt cod was at its height, but I don't know what she made of the smell. Several sources tell me she loved to draw and to make things, model boats, birch bark bitten into elaborate patterns, sketches of animals, and portraits of loved ones. One servant woman who she worked alongside in the west of the island reported that she was always happiest when a pencil was in her hands. Most of what Shanawdithit created no longer survives. But what she drew with her pencil at Cormack's house beside St. John's Harbor between 1828 and 1829 was extraordinary. Over a few months, she produced the only first-hand accounts we have of Beothuk history and culture that exist or ever existed as far as we know. Her story maps, images, and testimony remain the only direct historical sources we have from any Beothuk individual at any point in history. The stories she told and drew relate dramatic encounters, terrible violence, and epic journeys across some of the harshest terrain on Earth. They illuminate a vibrant, resilient culture, a people who were connected to their indigenous neighbors, the Mi'kmaq and the Innu, but distinct from them as well. They relay a life shaped by kin, by making, by journeying, by tragedy and resistance. And they reveal in their creator an artist of remarkable talents, a rebellious woman who bore witness to the death of her world. But all of this is eclipsed by the role that Shanawdithit has played since her death, just a few months after completing her drawings. William Cormack penned her obituary from a rented flat in London in the autumn of 1829. This interesting female lived 6 years a captive among the English, he wrote. Her people, who were an anomaly in that they never held intercourse with Europeans, had, quote, lived, flourished, and become extinct in their own orbit, in one of our oldest and most important colonies. It was the first time that this word, extinct, was applied to a group of human beings. And I should say now that I reject this word for several reasons. Firstly, because it's part of a settler colonial fantasy that imagines indigenous people as disappeared or gone in order to make room for the settler belonging. But secondly, because the Beothuk were human beings, and human beings are very much not extinct. And describing a particular subgroup or culture of human beings as extinct is a fundamentally racist concept. Nonetheless, Shanawdithit was dubbed the last of the Red Indians, and the history has been recited by rote ever since. I remember it well from my school textbooks back in Newfoundland, from my childhood museum visits, and from heritage plaques that dot the cityscape of St. John's. The Beothuk were a shy people who refused to trade with Europeans and retreated into the interior of the island to avoid violent encounters with white settlers. In this barren place, they slowly dwindled from starvation and disease until they went extinct when the last Beothuk, Shanawdithit, also known as Nancy April, died in 1829. In this version of events, repeated like a litany, a woman's death looms larger than her life, and a people are fated to disappear, pushed aside by the relentless force of settler colonialism. But it is possible to tell a very different story about this woman who, before her emblematic death, lived an extraordinary and important life. So, in this lecture, I want to tell you about Shanawdithit's life story and about her people, who witnessed the end of their world because of colonialism. I want to do this, first and foremost, because so very few people outside of Newfoundland have even heard of her or of her people, and both deserve to be far better known. There are challenges here. As Kate Fulligar writes, quote, "The task of portraying whole Indigenous lives in all their subtlety and complexity, lives captured only in fragments by unsympathetic sources, presents a huge philosophical and methodological challenge to the craft of biography. Empire and its overbearing archive dismissed Indigenous creativity, marginalized these peoples, imagined them absent, belittled their lives, and rationalized their deaths. So how, Fulligar asks, is their full humanity now to be reclaimed?" Restoring to Shanawdithit some semblance of her full humanity is the chief aim of the account that follows. But through the story of Shanawdithit and her people, I also want to illuminate the history of their island, the place we call Newfoundland. England's very first transatlantic colonial possession, and the site of one of the most totalizing destructions of an Indigenous culture in British imperial history. My approach to all of this may be slightly unconventional for an academic lecture, in that I want mostly to tell you a story. I think that stories are where people make the best sense of things, and that there's no better way to explore complex histories than through storytelling. I also see this storytelling, and Shanawdithit's incredible story especially, as a counterpoint to trends in scholarship about empire. You probably noticed that there's been a real publishing boom in books about empire. Alan Lester et al.'s Truth About Empire, Sathnam Sangara's Empire Land and Empire World, Peter Frankopan's The Earth Transformed, Amitav Ghosh's The Great Derangement, I could go on. I think all of these books are incredibly important, and I'm very, very glad to see them. But they mostly take a bird's eye view of colonialism and imperialism. A kind of whistle-stop tour of different places and peoples who were invaded, occupied, subjugated, and incorporated into the sprawling beast that was the British Empire. This can give us a sense of scale and complexity, for sure, but it also can sometimes flatten individual human stories set in specific places, and these stories lie at the heart of everything. So what I hope to show through the story that I'm about to tell is that each place that was harmed through colonialism was, in the words of Audra Mitchell, a unique and irreplaceable world. Winter's grip on the island of Newfoundland is vicious. Northeasterly winds bring blizzards that bury the landscape in snow that's measured in feet rather than inches. Freeze-thaw cycles send bands of freezing rain, sleet, and then plain old miserable cold rain before the snow falls again. The winter begins in November when the last of the partridge berries listen on the rocky barrens, and does not begin to relent until April, when the first intrepid plants peek through the snow and the whiskajacks, or grey jays, start to build their nests. In Shanawdithit's time, winter conditions were even more demanding, because 200 years ago, the Little Ice Age still held the northern regions of the globe in its grasp. Not only this, but the actual Ice Age had left a profound mark on the landscape of the island, when glaciers scraped the rocks near clean at least 10,000 years ago. And to this day, Newfoundland has some of the thinnest topsoil on Earth. It took immense knowledge and skill to survive as a people in such a place, and the Beothuk had done so for at least 2,000 years. They were perhaps the very first of North America's indigenous peoples to encounter white Europeans in the 11th century, when the Norse built a small settlement on the northern tip of the island. And then again, when white fishing vessels showed up in the 15th century. The English called them Red Indians on account of the ochre they used to stain their skin. This was the first people, as far as we know, to whom this term was applied. Whether Terre Nua to the Basques, Terre Neuve to the French, Terra Nova to the Portuguese, or Newfoundland to the Dutch, New-found land was the first apocryphal story that these nascent overseas empires told. But to the Irish, who supplied the majority of the indentured labor for the English enterprise there, the island came to be known as Talavamaishk, or the fishing ground. And it was the better name. Newfoundland's Grand Bank is a shallow ocean shelf created by the topsoil that was scraped from the island by those glaciers. And it stretched more than 36,000 square miles off the north, east, and southeast coast. It was the richest fishing ground for cod in the world. And for 5 centuries, the Newfoundland Grand Bank fishery would remain, quote, the largest single fishery on the planet. Lacking the allure of gold, silver, sugar, and tobacco, cod was an unfashionable but an extremely profitable product. More profitable than sugar, arguably one of the most profitable commodities of empire. Even if, as Paul Holm puts it, it has been grossly underestimated and under-researched. Despite the lack of attention, salt cod fueled the spread of immense empires and underscored the birth of a capitalist economic system. Cod was not just transformed by the triangle trade into wine, it also fueled the production of sugar. The worst grade of cod, as Eric Williams put it, fish that was fit for no other human consumption, was used to feed the enslaved on sugar plantations. Salt cod constituted, as historians like James Coundo and Cynthia Kennedy estimate, over 80% of the protein consumed by enslaved people on most plantations in the British Caribbean. Newfoundland fish workers were a vital node in this nexus of exploitation. For 2 centuries, between 1600 and 1800, men and boys would sign on as indentured servants in ports around the West Country and the southeast of Ireland. They were shipped in crews of 10 or 20 on sailing vessels to Newfoundland, where they traded their labor, their freedom, and sometimes their lives, for good and steady pay for 2 summers and a winter in between. They would work in small boats from late spring until late supper, catching and processing cod, which was salted and spread across fish flakes, which you see behind me, built upon the foreshore, where it would dry in the summer wind and sun, producing, at an incredible scale, a high-protein food that had a very long shelf life. Eventually, some of these fish workers began to stay on over the winter, including my ancestor, my 7 times great-grandfather, James Taverner, who was born on the island in 1635. I often wonder what my ancestors, who came to Newfoundland from the West Country over the course of the 17th and 18th centuries, thought when they first spied Newfoundland after many miserable weeks crossing the stormy Atlantic. They would have seen a jagged, rocky coastline of granite and shale, ribboned with quartz and the red of sandstone, with coves and inlets, with stony beaches that gave way to grass and wildflowers past the foreshore. And beyond that, what must have seemed to them, who had watched the oak woods of England turn into warships, like an impossibly endless forest of fir and spruce, birch and white pine. These ancestors of mine pitched on the edge of the island and built their houses and workrooms right on the foreshore, almost over the water, because they were there to do one thing: fish. Over the centuries, they built communities, developed a rich and unique culture. They built belonging through hard work, mutual aid, story, and song, and they also occupied, whether they knew it or not, Beothuk land. I could tell many stories about these settlers, my own family among them, but the main story I want to tell you tonight begins deep in the interior of the island, at a place almost entirely unknown to white settlers, which they called Red Indian Lake. The lake wound like a snake, and still winds, in fact, like a snake through the landscape, over 65 kilometers long, but less than 6 kilometers wide at its widest point. It's surrounded by a forest of birch and fir and rimmed with beaches of sandstone. When the wind blew, which was most of the time, the lake was like an ocean with its waves. But when winter came, it would freeze into a vast plain of ice and snow. This was the heartland of Beothuk winter territory, where different family bands came together each year as a tribe, and it was the site of the annual caribou hunt. The Beothuk built immense lengths of deer fence, over 40 kilometers long, from felled trees, that were used to corral the migrating caribou herd into the river and the waiting spears of hunters. The whole tribe would come together to spend the darkening days of late autumn butchering animals and storing the meat, bones, sinew, guts, and antlers for future use, including the construction and insulation of their homes called mamatiques. On the 23rd of January, 1812, Shanawdithit was 11 years old and had settled down for the night in her extended family's mamatique with her mother and father, her brother, her 2 sisters, and probably other family as well. Many family units like these were perched in clusters along dozens of kilometers of lakeshore. The night of the 23rd of January, 1812, was extremely cold, with the wind to the northeast. But Shanawdithit's home was fire warm when she curled up in her bed beside her family. She was still asleep when the morning of the 24th dawned, bitterly cold and clear. That is when the white men came. Shanawdithit and the others stumbled out of their shelter to find themselves surrounded by 26 armed Marines, a middle-aged naval lieutenant, and 3 fur trappers who they recognized immediately. These were John Peyton's men, the self-styled first citizen of the North, who had come to Beothuk territory in the 1740s on the northern coast of the island. They say that we should judge historical actors by the standards of their day, so I will. By the 1780s, John Peyton had come to be known far and wide as an Indian killer. We know from the Colonial record itself that he and his posse of servants mowed down a Beothuk village and set it on fire in the 1780s. We know that he beat a Beothuk man to death with a steel trap, and that at least one official begged the colonial secretary to expel him from the Newfoundland station. And we can be fairly certain that the Beothuk knew exactly what the men who worked for him looked like. David Buchan was the middle-aged lieutenant's name, and he was the one in charge. And as far as he was concerned, he had dragged himself, 26 Marines, and 3 of Peyton's men, alongside sleds laden with gifts, for 2 weeks through some of the most difficult terrain on Earth, because he was on a peace mission. His orders from Newfoundland's naval governor, John Duckworth, were to, quote, open up a friendly discourse with the Indians. Up until this point, the Beothuk had refused all contact with whites, who were to them unpredictable, avaricious, and often violent. They had been resisting the occupation of their seacoasts for 3 centuries. In earlier periods, whites had been a temporary problem because most of them got the hell off the island during the winter and left their stuff behind. There was no need to risk violent encounters through trade. The Beothuk simply waited until the great convoy of fishing ships had sailed east in late October, abandoning the fishing rooms that had been constructed the year before. The Beothuk would then go there and burn the damn things down, salvaging the iron nails and fish hooks for arrowheads and sailcloth for mamatique covers. The guts of ticking watches became necklaces. Steel traps became harpoons. But by the middle of the 18th century, the merchants and planters who had invaded Beothuk territory had figured out that the hundreds of thousands of quintals of salt cod, a quintal is a barrel size, they produced annually could be handsomely subsidized by tierces, another barrel size, of salmon and pelts and oil from seals. The salmon weirs began to stretch up to 40 miles upriver into the heartlands of Beothuk territory, dramatically affecting the number of salmon that could spawn. The commercial salmon fishery went from 1,000 tierces in the 1730 to 2,000 by that century's close, almost 1 million pounds of fish per year. This ice hunt, as the annual seal hunt was known, grew from 30,000 pelts a year in 1780 to 690,000 pelts per year in 1822. The great auk, the most important animal in Beothuk cosmology, was hunted to extinction around 1800, mostly for feathers and fish bait. The Beothuk did their best to withstand this invasion. Theft and sabotage, their chief and largely peaceful modes of protest, there were some murders, but most of the time it was largely peaceful protest, became the pretext for reprisals marked by horrific asymmetrical violence. Groups of planters and their posses of indentured servants would go in search of Beothuk camps to revenge some minor theft, armed to the teeth and more than willing to open fire. It did not take many of these people, and there weren't many of these people, to cause immense harm, not least because they also often destroyed or raided Beothuk food stores, which, as the settlers knew all too well, meant a death sentence for the people who depended on them in order to bridge the hungry gap in what passed for spring in this subarctic climate. As Shanawdithit shows here in her drawings, these food stores were carefully designed and enormous. Burning one down would spell starvation for many dozens of people. Some of the more humane naval officers who had been put in charge of law and order in the 18th century began wringing their hands. As the island's indigenous population clearly dwindled, fingers, as they were in other places with bloody frontiers, were pointed at the motley bunch of poor indentured settlers. In 1768, John Cartwright, a British naval lieutenant on the Newfoundland station, begged the Colonial Office to act. And I'm going to use a term now that is an offensive term, but it's a direct quote from the time. On the part of the English fishers, it is an inhumanity which sinks them far below the level of savages, he wrote to the Earl of Bathurst, then colonial secretary. The wantonness of their cruelties towards these poor wretches has frequently been almost incredible. The fishermen are much greater savages than the Indians themselves. Another local official begged Bathurst to bring about, quote, an end to hostilities between our savages and the native savages of this island. These pleas were met with virtually no response from the British Colonial Office, who, as they did elsewhere in the Empire, avoided spending money wherever possible. No patrols were sent to stop the violence. No Indian country was created. No Indian agent was dispatched. No trading post was established. No missionaries were sent to contact the Beothuk. Instead, inexpensive proclamations were made, threatening anyone who killed a red Indian with the king's very distant justice, and declaring anyone who brought a living one to the governor would receive a reward of 50 pounds, then later 100 pounds, thereby incentivizing violent kidnaps. When Shanawdithit was born in 1800 or 1801, we're not sure, the particular brand of negligent extractive colonialism practiced in Newfoundland, that kind with few responsibilities or costs, had devastated the Beothuk people. So, after terrifying Shanawdithit and her sleeping family and rousing them from their beds, the Marines and the Beothuk faced each other. According to Buchan, the encounter began well. There was handshaking, and the Marines distributed some of the gifts they had brought: red cloth, they knew the Beothuk liked red, cast iron, and knives. Buchan managed to convey that the party had left more gifts behind about a day's walk away, because the freeze-thaw conditions during their journey meant they had to abandon some of the sleds. 3 Beothuk men agreed to join him to go back to these abandoned sleds, and Buchan left 2 Marines behind, kind of as an act of good faith, Corporal James Boothland and Private Thomas Butler. But as they made their way back to the camp with these extra gifts, the Beothuk men began to act strangely, and Buchan grew increasingly concerned. His fears were realized when they arrived back at the lake to find the bodies of Boothland and Butler, which lay naked and headless on the lake ice. Now, ordinarily, we would only have a report from a British officer to go on to tell us about what happened on that cold January day more than 200 years ago. But because of Shanawdithit's testimony, which she recorded before her death in 1829, we have some idea of the Beothuk perspective as well. Oh, sorry, I should have shown you that quote before. So this is one of the more famous of her drawings, and if it's not otherwise stated, all of these images come from the Rooms Museum, and they're courtesy of them. They provided me with very high-quality scans. But even with these very high-quality scans, it's quite difficult to read these maps unless you spend many, many, many hours with them, as I have. But this is the lake shore. The writing you see is Cormack's. So Cormack's annotations were done as Shanawdithit was talking, and she was doing the drawing. She used a red pencil for her people and a gray pencil for whites. According to Shanawdithit, the Beothuk did not consider the encounter to be friendly at all. And it's easy to understand why, considering they had woken up surrounded by more than 24 armed soldiers. And they did not trust Buchan, however friendly he seemed, because no trustworthy man would travel with so much firepower and 3 known murderers. After Buchan and his men left, a heated discussion had followed, as the assembled Beothuk families, some 70 people in all, worked through the complex politics of a persecuted people. Some wanted to flee, some wanted to treat with the whites, who the Beothuk called Bukashamen. Still others called for violent revenge for the violence that they had suffered. Boothland and Butler were in this way very likely seen as avatars for all invaders. The latter won the day. When Boothland and Butler attempted to flee, perhaps, the Beothuk shot them in the back with arrows. They stripped them of their clothes, removed their heads, and placed them in baskets. Shanawdithit's drawing of the encounter shows how, with the men's heads in tow, her family traveled up the lake shore, warning other families. Together, the whole tribe crossed the frozen lake. You can see the big string of them crossing the lake, and traveled deeper into the forest, where they set up another camp. Here, they mounted the men's heads on poles and danced around them, celebrating their victory. And you can see that Shanawdithit has chosen to create a particular inset of the Marine's head on a pole, which I kind of can't help but think was intentionally humorous. Back at the lake, meanwhile, Buchan refused his men the vengeance they howled for and ordered a retreat. If you judge people by the standards of the day, Buchan was a fairly good egg, actually. I don't want to say too much about him, but he was all right. He didn't let them pursue the Beothuk. Instead, they marched back to their schooner, which they finally arrived at on the 30th of January, 1812. Their legs were swollen, their feet were bloody, and their skin was purple with frostburn. One Marine, John Weatherall, had become deranged in mind and had to have a guard placed over him. Buchan wanted to return to attempt another peace mission, but the War of 1812 scuppered his plans, and he was redeployed to be the convoy commodore for the Newfoundland fishing fleet to guard against the Americans. The British colonial government made no meaningful attempt to contact or help the Beothuk again. We know very little about Shanawdithit's life between the years 1812 and 1818. We can presume that, despite hardships, she got on with the business of living. She began to master artistic techniques and other craft work. She gathered, caught, and preserved food. She danced and sang. She told stories and listened to stories through the long winters with her kith and kin. But we also know that she was a witness to and a victim of profound violence. She showed Cormack the bullet scars in her hand and her leg from when she was shot by a fur trapper. And in what museum curators have labeled Sketch 5, she depicted a scene along the Exploits River from around 1816. which testifies to the murder of an unnamed Beothuk woman by John Peyton and his men. This incident is difficult to read into place in a specific location and appears to have been drawn in haste or in anger. Her lines are not as careful, and the scribbles of her red pencil spill like blood. There are hints in the scraps of notes, the only thing that survives from William Cormack's archive, that sometime between 1812 and 1818, Shanawdithit lost her birth mother and one of her sisters to settler violence. And it's possible that the map in Sketch 5 tells this story. In any case, this drawing, which depicts an incident that does not appear in the colonial records, stands as a synecdoche for all the other violence whose record has not survived at all. Perhaps this is why, in 1818, if not before, Shanawdithit joined the resistance. And I'm labeling it a resistance. This is not necessarily something you'll find in the historiography. In the autumn of that year, she and other Beothuk traveled up the Exploits River to Notre Dame Bay, where Peyton and other planters and merchants had built their settlements. They slipped beneath the wharf of John Peyton Jr., that's the son of the man I had mentioned before, of his salmon station at Sandy Point, under the cover of darkness, and waited, bobbing in their canoes, while the man on the wharf finished loading up the season's salmon catch, pickled in barrels, destined for the European market. It's understandable why this was the target of the raid. The Beothuk had no interest in cod, a lean, deep-water ground fish that they had no means or motivation to get. The pelagic salmon, on the other hand, was the Beothuk's chief source of food before the caribou herds began to migrate. Peyton's operation, the largest on the Exploits River, with over 10 weirs on the river and its tributaries, had cut the salmon almost entirely off from their spawning grounds. Not only was the salmon industry threatening the food resources of the Beothuk in the short term, it threatened the very existence of this animal. We can assume that the Beothuk worldview, like most other North American indigenous worldviews, made no clear distinction between people and the more than human world of which they were a part. So an attack on the salmon was an attack on the Beothuk. Shanawdithit and her fellow raiders waited beneath the wharf's pylons in dead silence until the lights from the white men's lanterns stopped shining through the slats of wood above them. Then they emerged and stripped the boat of all useful items, food, sailcloth, iron, and a brass pocket watch belonging to Peyton's great-grandfather that had come all the way from Winburn-Mr. Dorset. They took all the rifles and broke them and threw them in the water because the Beothuk appeared to have had the strongest possible cultural taboo against the use of firearms. Then they cut the boat loose, causing it to drift into the bay, and slipped off into the night unnoticed. When Peyton discovered the damage the next morning, he was incensed and went straight to the governor, now Sir Charles Hamilton, who gave him permission to go into the interior to search for his possessions and, ostensibly, open up a friendly discourse with the Indians. In truth, Hamilton had little control over the matter either way. Colonialism in because governance in this period was minimal. Colonialism in Newfoundland, like in so many other places, was not some kind of organized or rational force, but to borrow from William Dalrymple, it was an anarchy. The reach of the law was extremely limited, and settler violence against Indigenous people was ignored and ultimately tolerated, not because there was some kind of organized campaign to eliminate the Beothuk, but because to protect them would have cost too much money. It was in this context that the John Peytons, were allowed to lead a heavily armed posse of trappers and fishermen back to the place they called Red Indian Lake in March of 1819. Peyton and his men snuck up on the Beothuk encampment in the early hours of the morning of March 19th. But before they could reach the cluster of Mamatiques, someone sounded an alarm. The Beothuk had a very elaborate warning system. You can see why. And the people fled across the lake ice. Shanawdithit's drawing of the incident commits to permanency the temporary marks of their footprints on the snow and the crimes that subsequently unfolded. She fled with the rest of her family, including her uncle, Nonasabasset, and Shanawdithit's friend, his wife, Damasduit. Damasduit was only a few years older than Shanawdithit and had just given birth to her and Nonasabasset's first child 2 days before. Together, the families ran. Damasduit passed the baby to a kinsman, fighting to keep up, but a few moments later, she stumbled and fell. The white men were soon upon her, hauling her up from the snow and ignoring her pleas to spare her. They had on their minds, of course, King George IV's reward of £100 for the capture of any living Red Indian. Demasduit's husband ran back, entreating Peyton to let his wife go. He spoke in Beothuk, of course, but surely the white man understood what he was saying. When words failed, Nonasabasset attempted to physically wrest Demasduit away. Then, one of Peyton's men drove a bayonet into his back, and next, Peyton Sr. shot him. They left him to die on the ice, bound Demasduit's arms, and brought her back to a white settlement. They called her Mary March, after the month in which she was captured. In the end, Peyton and his men did stand trial for murder, but the grand jury found them not guilty by reason of self-defense. Shanawdithit's drawing of the incident and her accompanying testimony to Cormack offers further indictments. A second Beothuk man, she insisted, was also killed that day. And then, in red pencil, she drew a small red bundle near where the lake met the river. This is the place where Demasduit and Nonasabasset's baby died, 2 days after its mother was taken. According to Cormack, Shanawdithit would weep whenever she spoke of this, and it's clear that she was determined that this baby's life and death made the mark on history she felt it deserved when she drew this picture. Then, a year later, she bore witness from the lakeside trees to an expedition of Marines led by David Buchan again. This time, they pulled Demasduit's coffin. Shanawdithit could not know it, but Demasduit had died of tuberculosis, contracted shortly after she was taken. This loss, heaped upon loss, marked the beginning of the end of the Beothuk world. By 1823, many Beothuk had left the island as family bands took the difficult decision to abandon their homelands and travel to the territories of the Innu, their closest allies, whose territory of Nitassinan stretched across what we would call Labrador and Quebec. It was easy to get there. The Strait of Belle Isle is a very narrow body of water. Some others joined the Mi'kmaq on Newfoundland's southern coast, marrying into those families or going even further south to Mohawk territory. Countless others died from direct violence of guns or the indirect violence of starvation before they could leave. For a time at least, Shanawdithit's family band stayed, but in the spring of 1823, they were facing starvation. Without the whole tribe to maintain the deer fences, the caribou hunt was not as successful. Going to the coast for shellfish, seal, or seabirds meant risking death by a white man's bullet. But the cruel, hungry gap of April 1823 gave them no choice. Shanawdithit drew her and her family's journey of more than 300 miles, showing how they had cleverly pawned and island hopped to avoid white settlements. It was not enough. Along the way, another uncle and her cousin were shot dead, and her father drowned, attempting to flee across a half-frozen river. Upon her drawings of these horrific incidents, Cormack scrawled his cruel arithmetic. How many of her people remained? First 27, then 12, then 3. Shanawdithit, alongside her adoptive mother and her sister, made it to the coast, where they soon found themselves staring down the barrel of a trapper's gun. The trapper loaded the 3 women into his boat and took them through the beautiful island-studded bay that used to be their homeland. He brought them to the home of none other than John Peyton Jr. on exploits, Burnt Island. Within weeks, Shanawdithit's adoptive mother and sister had perished from tuberculosis. She buried the last 2 members of her whole extended family in graves by the sea. She spent the next 5 years of her life living with John Peyton as a servant. While at his house, she was apparently free to come and go. We've got many sources that affirm that. And she frequently talked back to her mistress in her particular brand of Newfoundland English. And she made things. Birch bark snowflakes, paper snowflakes, a caribou hide dress decorated in red ochre, and dozens of long-lost pencil drawings. It's difficult for me to make sense of this time in Shanawdithit's life. Newer historical narratives, highly suspicious of the Imperial Archive, would emphasize her subjugation and her clear status as a victimized and oppressed woman who was left with very few choices in her life. And I recognize that. But I also feel that it's important to see Shanawdithit as an agential human being who made the most of limited choices she had, and despite the violence and tragedy and dispossession she experienced, still kept living and creating and trying to tell her story. We do the past a great disservice when we attempt to flatten complex lives into narratives of victims and perpetrators, of heroes and villains, because simplistic victimhood erases important moments of resilience and resistance, and simplistic villainy exculpates the normative systems of which exploiters were a part. If anyone transcends the villain-hero binary, it's William Epps Cormack. Cormack was the Newfoundland-born son of Scottish merchant and had returned to Britain's Western Atlantic colonies in 1818 to resettle dispossessed Highlanders on Mi'kmaq land in the newly named Prince Edward Island. He arrived back in Newfoundland in 1822 after the death of his mother to settle his family affairs there. And somewhere during this time, grief and imperialism combined to make him hatch a plan to become the first white man to walk across the island's interior. As a mineralogist who trained under the famous Professor Robert Jameson in Edinburgh, Cormack wanted to prove that the Newfoundland interior was indeed improvable, potentially rich in mineral resources like gold and coal, and boasting plenty of arable land. He was definitely wrong on the arable land part. Like many natural historians of the day, Cormack was interested in flora, fauna, rocks, as well as other supposedly primitive cultures. So another part of his mission was to find the Red Indians. This first walk, performed with a Mi'kmaq guide, Joseph Sylvester, in 1823, gained him some renown, but he did not find the Beothuk. Indeed, he is unlikely to have survived at all if it were not for his guide. Over the ensuing 5 years, he became more obsessed with the Beothuk, amid growing fears of their extirpation. This was the dawn of imperial humanitarianism, an intellectual and philanthropic movement that advocated for the rights and well-being of Aborigines in British settlements, without advocating for the end of the occupation of their lands, of course. And Cormack fits within this contradictory context very well. He founded the Beothuk Institute in 1827, one of the first European associations in history to consider the rights of an indigenous people. In his inaugural address, he declared that, quote, "Britons have trespassed here to be a blight and a scourge on a portion of the race. A defenseless and once independent tribe of men have been nearly extirpated from the earth without hardly any inquiry how or why." The Institute funded a second walk with 3 more indigenous guides, this time down the exploits to Red Indian Lake in 1827. But all Cormack found was, quote, "abandoned vapor huts and tents, and long expanses of deer fence going to decay." He also found the graves of Nonasabasset, Damasduit, and their infant child, which had been placed there some 7 years before after Buchan had left the coffin. Cormack, looking to impress his former tutor, Robert Jameson, removed the skulls from their bodies and put them, alongside the grave goods, into his rucksack like chunks of granite. He returned to the coast, half dead and nearly defeated, but still clinging to his belief in the fundamental goodness of empire. Quote, "It is to be lamented now," he wrote in his report of his second expedition, "when we have taken up the cause of a barbarously treated people, so few of them should remain to reap the benefits of our plans for their civilization." Upon his return, he learned of one Beothuk woman who might yet become the object of his noble rescue. They called her Nancy April after the month she was first captured, but her real name was Shanawdithit. Cormack spirited Shanawdithit away from Peyton's house when he was away, against his wishes. There's no record of what her wishes were or whether anyone thought to ask. There is also no record of when she first began coughing the blood that was the hallmark of active stage tuberculosis. We do not know whether Cormack was kind or coercive, whether he treated Shanawdithit as a human being or as a curiosity. From the scraps that remain of his archive, we can see that he was incensed that Shanawdithit was left to labor in obscurity in a remote outpost. But this was as much because he wanted to study her as a specimen as it was out of concern for her rights and well-being. Cormack left Newfoundland for the final time a few months before she died. And before he did, and this is the content warning, I'm about to get into some really difficult material, he told the colony's Surgeon General to dissect her body after death, despite the fact that in his own archive there are repeated moments when she talks about how that was one of her greatest fears. And to remove her skull and to ship it to London. So, if it weren't for Cormack's work with Shanawdithit, we'd have no first-hand account of her people and their history. We would know so much less, and the Beothuk would be even more gone. But we have to hold this truth together with the stolen skulls and the desecrated bodies, because both are imperial inheritances. Tuberculosis is a disease that stalks the poor. It thrives in bodies weakened by hard work and poor nutrition. It spreads in crowded and unsanitary conditions, and it kills slowly. When Cormack left, he sent Shanawdithit to the Attorney General's house, but when she grew too ill to be cared for there, David Buchan came again and brought her to the Naval Hospital on the harbor's south side, at a place called Riverhead, which was not far from Roop's plantation. From the window of the hospital, maybe she could watch the harbor. Maybe she could hear the river. Maybe she spoke its Beothuk name. She died at the end of June, the month when spring arrives, sudden and beautiful to the island, and ethereal icebergs visit its coast. Dr. Carson did as Cormack suggested and sent her scalp and skull to the Royal College of Physicians in London, and later transferred it was later transferred, to the Royal College of Surgeons in 1938. The rest of Shanawdithit's body was buried in a pauper's grave on the south side of the harbor, and its exact location has never been found. On May 11th, 1941, the Royal College of Surgeons was hit by a German incendiary device, collapsing most of the building and destroying at least 2/3 of its specimen collection. The damage was photographed by the museum staff the next day. Black and white images in the college archive show dozens of crania scattered amid the fallen floorboards and rubble. When viewed as a whole, the image the museum staff took that day in 1941 is a testament both to the destruction of war and to the violence of imperialism. I have searched in vain for Shanawdithit's remains among the Royal College of Surgeons' salvaged archival records, where strings of numbers tell me that only 1/7 of their human crania collection was destroyed that day. But that's where the trail ends. There are things I will never know. Shanawdithit's partial remains may be among the rubble of a bombed medical museum. They may lie in pieces beneath the streets of 21st century London. Or maybe they still exist somewhere, uncatalogued and misidentified, among the collections of Empire's institutions today. Shanawdithit's physical remains are not the only remnants of the Beothuk and their territory that still sit in boxes, in drawers, and on shelves in Britain and her former colonial possessions. Some of the grave goods that Cormack stole from Nona Sabasit's tomb are housed at the British Museum, including the fringe of his belt and a beautiful meat dish taken from the chief's tomb. It's written on it, it's not even trying to hide it. It still smells of the birch it was made with, that rich, spicy smell of old wood. Until recently, the skulls of Damasduit and Nona Sabasit are sat in boxes in the National Museum of Scotland's Crania storeroom, until a repatriation campaign in 2020, led by a Newfoundland Mi'kmaq man, Chief Misal Joe, saw them returned to their island. The other grave goods that Cormack sent with them, a doll and a model canoe, remain in Scotland. There are currently no plans for their return. The beautiful pendants that Shanawdithit's people made, carved in intricate patterns from caribou antler, are scattered every which way. There are some in the Pitt Rivers Museum in Oxford, some at the British Museum, at the Cambridge Museum of Anthropology and Archaeology, and dozens of other places. Scrapers, arrowheads, owls, and harpoon heads are held in more than 20 museums around Britain, the Commonwealth, and the United States, mostly in boxes and not on display. And near the river in Greenwich, under a warm downlight in the National Maritime Museum's Atlantic Gallery, sits the most precious of Shanawdithit's surviving creations. A model about a foot long of a Beothuk canoe. One could be forgiven for walking past it, overshadowed as it is by larger and more detailed gunships and frigates. But it is extraordinary, not least because, unlike so many indigenous artworks collected by the amateur ethnographers of empire, this piece has survived into the present with its artist's name attached. And I thank Claire Warrior, who is one of the curators at the National Maritime Museum, for pointing that out to me. Shanawdithit stitched the gunnels and stem of this model with spruce root sinew, pliable like leather. Upon the gunnels, she put a delicate border of wood, fixed down with drawing pins from the household sewing box at the Peyton's place. It's difficult to say if she was the one who lacquered the model, or if this was done by the sea captain who asked her to make it, or by Somerset House or the Royal Naval Museum as it passed through their hands. But we do know that before she gave it to Captain Jones, she rubbed it with ochre, likely mixed with seal fat, so that the canoe had a deep red color and a lovely sheen. However extraordinary and wonderful it is that Shanawdithit's canoe still survives, it is painful to see how it, and so much other material, has been ripped from their stories. No one would know the epic tale of violence, tragedy, resilience, and resistance that Shanawdithit stitched into this beautiful boat. And one of the things I would argue as this lecture draws to a close is that we need to work to restore these stories as much, if not more, than we need to just repatriate the objects themselves. Shanawdithit's story is one among millions in the history of North America's empire alone, where many indigenous nations were decimated through war and disease. And as extraordinary as it is that, thanks to Shanawdithit, and reluctantly thanks to Cormack too, we have Shanawdithit's story, knowing hers demands that we acknowledge those that did not survive. But the history I've told you here is not just Schenectady. It's an important story in its own right, even if you know or care about Newfoundland. Shanawdithit's island was the site of incredible over-extraction, and it was one of the earliest spaces to experience the environmental cost of this avarice. Shanawdithit's story is also a story of imperial entanglements, of the greed and violence that underwrote them and the price that people and the planet paid. Newfoundland was one of the earliest sites for what Audra Mitchell would call the systematic destruction of bioplurality that became the hallmark of imperial capitalism. Shanawdithit experienced losses and injustices so great that she would be forgiven for never being able to appreciate, let alone create, beauty again. And yet, at a desk in William Cormack's house by the harbor and the river, in the months before her death, she created a beautiful and vitally important elegy for the world that had been taken from her. She single-handedly ensured the survivance, however fraught and slight, of an entire culture of people. She reminds us what an act of hope it is to tell a story, even at the end of the world. Thank you very much.